I just think that the greatest founders don't care too much about the macro. I just think that if they're obsessed about this thing that they need to build, they're not going to be like, oh, is it a great time to be raising money right now? Oh, is it like what's happening out there? No, they're just going to go and build it. Because a lot of exits that we see, I would actually say that like minimum 25%, maybe more exits that are announced are situations where like the investors didn't even get their money back, or the founders didn't make any money, and they are fire sales, right? And they are pay off your debts or wrap everything up nicely and clean. I wanted to not set an example, but at least show a little bit behind the curtains that these exits are not necessarily what we always make them out to be. I did not want to be walking around thinking I was some hotshot exited founder when that wasn't the truth.
With us today is Niel Murray, who is the founder and general partner of the Nordic Web, an early-stage investment fund focused on the Nordic startup ecosystem. Niel has been a key player in supporting and investing in some of the most exciting startups in the region. And I am personally very excited to have Niel on the podcast today. So welcome, Niel.
Thank you for having me, Esben.
So I'm just going to jump straight into it. You have built the Nordic Web. We spoke about this before the podcast because I remember you from back in the days when I worked in venture capital I don't remember it was 16 or 17, but at least I remember the Nordic Web. And you built that into a sort of leading early stage investment company here in the Nordics. But you've also been an operator, having co-founded the company called Playmaker that was part of Y Combinator. So you worked on both sides of the table as an investor and an operator, which is fantastic because I like to hear both perspectives. Do you think, and if yes, probably the question here, that has changed your perspective on investing? And if so, yeah, how?
Yes, it has, right? And I think I had a little bit of a weird background or abnormal background because I was an investor, then I was a founder, then I was an investor again. Right? So I was actually an investor, even though I had founded the Nordic Web. It was not a tech startup, and I would not consider myself to have been a founder in the kind of sense of the word that we're talking about here until I founded my company Playmaker. It was a little bit weird being investor, founder, then investor. And so I've been able to really look at myself and how I have changed as an investor, both before and after. And I think the big difference is definitely the empathy I have for founders and the understanding I have of founders in the earliest days of building their company is much, much higher. Obviously, I did 3.5 years of the journey. We then fire sold the company. And so I've also, hired and fired. I've been through kind of the most common challenges that you go through in that early period of building a company. So firsthand experience of it and having faced many of those challenges can also be perhaps a better partner to founders at the earlier stages. At least that's what I hope.
It makes a lot of sense. And I'm curious, what led you to go out and go, from being an investor to starting Playmaker? Was there anything that led you specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. That? I mean, I was just following my heart, and that's what I've done throughout my career. I mean, becoming an investor, just it was never a plan. It was just something that I really wanted to do. And so I went after and did it. But I had made around 30 investments from a couple of angel funds I had raised. And then the plan for me was to raise a much bigger vehicle in 2019, 10 to 15 million dollars or euros, and be a solo GP back before that even had a name. But what happened was 6 months leading up to it, all I could think about was this idea I had, or at least this obsession I had about how a particular industry was going to unfold. And I spent all my time thinking about this and what the future of that industry would be, what would be the best way to kind of attack that. Starting a company didn't even feel like a choice. It felt like I just have to go and do this because I feel like I am the right person to build this company. And so it felt very much like the company or the opportunity kind of chose me rather than me choosing to be a founder. And despite my company not working out in the way that I wanted it to, those are qualities that I look for in founders today, that obsession or that almost lack of choice, that you have to go after this and build this company, because that's what happened to me. And it that's why I did that instead of continue to be an investor, right?
So, but you sold the company, or fire sale as you called it, and then you went back to being an investor. Could you just talk
Yes.
about this for a few minutes?
Yeah, sure. So honestly, for like a year after the company, I didn't know what to do. I took it pretty hard personally. Like, my whole kind of identity was tied up in that company. That was hard because I was like, okay, woke up the next day. What do I do now? That was my life for 3.5 years. And I think having that lack of direction and purpose was one of the hardest things that I've experienced in my life, because I've always been kind of looking for the next thing. I always knew what the next thing was. And then all of a sudden being confronted by questions like, what am I going to do next? Or who am I? Or super, super hard, right? So after around a year, I realized, what do I love doing? I love working with founders. And so I raised a little angel vehicle for the third time in my career to go out and do that again, while actually exploring what I really wanted to do. So there was some optionality around that in my mind. And then I looked at maybe join a VC fund, maybe start a professional women's football club in Copenhagen. I also explored that quite deeply. Eventually, kind of like 6 months ago, I got that like fire in my belly again. And that's what I need to go and do something, to have that inner motivation, inner drive, ambition. And now I have that again. And I want to I am building a first check fund for the Nordics. So solo GP fund, kind of like what I was meant to do before I started my company.
And I'm going to ask a little bit more about that. But I'm very curious, like having that your full identity in your job. I think I've tried that a few times myself, and I've seen a lot of people sort of experience that, and that's okay when things are going fine.
Yeah.
But then when they don't, and they don't go so well, it could be very, very mentally draining. Was there anything you did to sort of help you get through this?
Yeah, I spoke to other people who had been in similar situations, right? So actually the thing that helped me the most was speaking to other founders who had also not succeeded or had found it hard after shutting down their company, or even found it hard after success or an exit, right? Like that, what is next question is not just when you fail, but sometimes also when you succeed. So honestly, speaking to my peers, speaking to other founders, speaking to people who understood, because even your loved ones, right? They're with you all the time, and they're of course supportive and know that what you are doing takes a lot from you, and they are there for you as much as they can be. But being a founder is such a unique experience, and it can be such a lonely experience at times, right? But even with having a co-founder and a great relationship, which never actually, even was harmed, even when things were tough. But I know there were still times when both of us felt lonely, even though we had each other in it, right? And so having that support from other people who have been in similar situations, I think was like really key to me. And then the other thing, as cliche as it is, was just time.
And one thing I personally really like was that you are so honest about the exit, because I think most of us have seen the exits where you look at them and you think, pretty sure that business was going nowhere. And all of a sudden they have sold the company.
Yeah.
And there are quite a few of those who obviously didn't sell. So I really like this. And I also noticed that you did this in a LinkedIn post, right? You got a lot of positive feedback on that honesty, which perhaps is more common in a country like the US than it is in Scandinavia. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so, right? And like I had some motivations for writing that post, and I wanted to show others that it was okay to fail, and it was okay to have an exit that is not really an exit, right? Because a lot of exits that we see, I would actually say that like minimum 25%, maybe more exits that are announced are situations where like the investors didn't even get their money back, or the founders didn't make any money, and they are fire sales, right? And they are pay off your debts or wrap everything up nicely and cleaned, but and that's it. And sometimes we fall into the trap of celebrating these exits, right? And I wanted to not set an example, but at least show a little bit behind the curtains that these exits are not necessarily what we always make them out to be. And then the other motivation was just a more selfish one. I did not want to be walking around thinking I was some hotshot exited founder when that wasn't the truth. And I was scared of lying to myself and the impact that would have on me in the future. And so we talk about kind of, what did I do to work out of that kind of funk that I was in for a year? That was part of my process, was actually facing up to the reality of what happened and then being honest about that to the world, but also to myself. And so that was my other motivation for doing it. It was a selfish motivation.
Yeah. I support what you did, at least. Niel, let's jump a little bit into your current focus of early stage investing. So one of the things you talked about is that pre-seed investors often focus on the wrong metric, basically, lifetime value, customer acquisition cost. In your view, what do you think they should be prioritizing? Not to say that these things are not important, but in terms of like prioritizing the most important, where would you look?
Yeah, well, I'm definitely looking at the team, looking at the founders. So what I like to establish is a little bit what I touched on already, right? Is like motivation for doing this, obsession for doing this, and why your team, why this area, why are you going to win? So I like to establish what would you be doing if you were not doing this. I find that helpful in terms of trying to figure out kind of how obsessed they are about it. I also like to figure out the why. So what I am trying to establish is this a career move or is this what you really want to be doing? And I think I'm looking to weed that out. You need that drive, you need that fire. And I think anyone who's doing it for a career choice is not going to succeed.
Do you think the current market conditions also weeded out a lot of that for you?
Yes, to an extent, but I still think it is happening. It's just happening less. And the profiles that are able to do it are fewer, which is a good thing, because the majority of the profiles that are still able to do it are typically good profiles. So they're more likely to be repeat founders than they are operator jump into being a founder for the first time.
You've been in the game for quite some time, so you've seen a little bit more than me, but at least I started out in venture capital in, was it 16 or 17? 17, I think. And a lot has happened in those years. And I remember back then there were almost no repeat founders. There were some, but not that many, at least in Norway. I'm speaking mostly in Norway, where I'm based. Sweden is a different case. Denmark and Norway have followed each other a bit more. I think now Denmark is a little bit ahead. But you have also talked about there are more and more repeat founders or people who have been part of a scaling journey now coming out. So you have more and more talent for building companies. Could you just talk a little bit about that? And when I've seen you comment on this before, it made me optimistic of the future for Scandinavia.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a positive. It does come with the warning that I just said, that just because you've been an operator, a great operator, doesn't mean that you're going to be a great entrepreneur. It doesn't necessarily mean that. It does mean, however, that you have been on the inside of a company and gained great experience that a lot of people and a lot of founders don't have and could benefit from. So there are...
Sorry to interrupt. Is there a phase? Let's say I have been part of, I'm not going to mention any names, a unicorn, but I joined as employee number 200, and I was there, and now we are 1,000. Do you, as an early stage investor, do you value that less than a person who's been there from 10 to 20 or not one, then you would have founded it, but like from the very, very early days? Is there different views on when they have joined the company for you?
Yeah, I would say so. But it is still just one data point, right? And that's
Mm.
also the point that I'm trying to make, is that I wouldn't necessarily just jump and invest in someone because they had worked at X. So it is still just a data point. I would say that I think being 10 to 200 is definitely more applicable in terms of what I'm looking for when I'm investing in someone, because they have been there at the early stage. And so I think that that is something that's more important, but it is still just one data point.
Oh, and I agree. And it's, I was curious to hear your opinion, because at least I've found that many put a lot of value on those logos and sometimes forget to look at what part of the journey they've actually been on. There's a big difference in going in from 200 to 500, right? Versus the very early, very scrappy days of having to do a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
You talked about, Niel, that the importance of having investors in the early days that can really help you. What do you think investors should be able to help you with? And when you say early days, are you thinking pre-seed, seed? What would you define?
Yeah, I think pre-seed, right, is primarily what I'm talking about. But I do think like there's definitely value from that your seed investors bring as well. But like my bread and butter is pre-seed, so that's what I'm mainly referring to. It's figuring out where you can add value and fit in the same way that you're composing a team, right? Within a founding team, you want to be plugging the holes, right? That you're not filling. So in your early hires, you want to fill the gaps that maybe you don't have the expertise in your founding team. And I think a little bit, it's the same way with your earliest investors. So if a team is like very technical or very product focused, very technical, maybe they're not the greatest fundraisers, right? And then on the flip side, if it's a team that are full of great salespeople or very great commercial, but say maybe lack a little product or technical skills, then you want to fill the gap that way as well. I would say that my strengths are in narrative building, in fundraising, in my network, in terms of being a founder before. And so I often am drawn towards companies and founders that I feel like I can make somewhat of an impact, right? Or I can help in some way to bridge that gap where they need me. Would I only invest in companies that need me? No.
No, would it typically, your contribution, is that typically around fundraising then and network? Because you are a very well connected guy.
I think that is one of the main areas, but I would actually say that the role that I perform for a lot of my companies is just being this kind of available, kind of friendly person on the cap table, but who isn't afraid to tell you how it is very honest, is very direct, doesn't bullshit much, but will still help you, right? And so I think that that is actually my primary value to a lot of these companies. But of course, that's a lot softer than saying I can help you with fundraising or I can help you with X.
I guess that's like what gets you in the door as an investor. At least my view of you would be that you are extremely well connected to also all the funds, right?
Yeah.
You have a strong name, but then what really adds value when you're there, I can easily imagine that your experience from Playmaker, as we talked about, and having been on that side and knowing what they go through is extremely valuable because as you said, as a founder, it becomes very lonely, right? It's so to have a confidant is super important. Yeah, you have some interesting views on where you see the Nordic pre-seed market. Are there any sort of interesting trends you have been seeing right now here in early 2025? Any changes?
Yeah, I think that I have seen a lot of founders want some sort of optionality. And what I mean by that is that they're not necessarily going out the gates and raising these big rounds that we've kind of touched upon, but are raising more like, say, a more modest amount, like 1 mil. And then from angels, from micro funds, then taking the decision at a later point of whether this is like a VC rocket or whether it's going to be a more sustainable company. And so I'm seeing more and more founders explore that route as a way of building a company. And so I'm definitely seeing that. My view is, though, that the best and most ambitious founders will still want to raise venture and be on that path. And that is the path that I am also playing in, and the path that I want to help founders on. But I do believe there's more than one way to build a company, right? And I have friends who have built great bootstrapped companies. And I certainly don't believe venture is the answer to everything. It's just, I am in that game. That is the game I'm playing. And I know the rules and I'm comfortable with the rule set. And so that optionality is definitely something I'm seeing more. So kind of founders erring on the edge of caution or raising kind of less, even the ones that can with a profile, say, raise free out the gate, are choosing not to.
Is there anything about the investor compositions that you typically see on the cap table that has changed? Like back to the, again, probing the question a bit, but perhaps the angel investor landscape also maturing a bit.
Yes.
And the reason for asking is that at least in the time I've been in ventures, I think I've seen more and more angel investors coming in, ex-operators, occurring operators, wanting to also to do some investing on the side.
I think that is definitely the case. I still find it hard, though, to fill a pre-seed round with great people. I still find that a struggle. And it's easier than it was, but I still am sometimes like scratching my brain like, okay, who else could I introduce this company to that I think is a great investor? I think there are more operators and more experienced angels, but oftentimes they are still quite small checks, right? So to bring that round together, you still need people writing bigger checks. And that is where I struggle a bit locally. And then I start turning to people from outside the Nordics and bringing little micro funds from outside of the Nordics into the deals that I'm doing, but also with some angels and operators from within the Nordics. So I would say definitely improvement, but there are a lot of times where I still am like, who else could I speak to about this company?
I can imagine. We talked about sort of the founder landscape, hopefully only getting better as more people go through sort of these journeys. What do you think about the current state of the venture capital landscape in the Nordics? And how has that developed in the last, let's say, 8 to 10 years?
I think for a long time, we've been waiting for these experienced operators, repeat founders coming out of these big companies from the Nordic. I believe that time has finally happened. We've been speaking about it for a long time, but it has now happened. Do I think that the investor landscape or venture capital has evolved at the same pace? I don't. I mean, even if you consider Europe rather than Nordics, only 6% of European VCs have founder experience. That's Europe. And in the US, it's like 60% plus. So that's not even the Nordics. And I would say in the Nordics, we're probably below even that 6%. And for me, that isn't great. Of course, I'm talking my own book that I'm an ex-founder who's an investor. So of course I believe in that. But I definitely think it would be a valuable thing more generally if we could push that number up a bit. I don't actually think that being a founder makes you a better investor if you are looking at the objective of make a lot of money or return a lot of money to your LPs. I have no idea whether being a founder will make me better at my job in terms of returning money. I don't know. And I think that you can have been a founder or not been a founder and probably achieve great returns and probably achieve poor returns. So I'm not saying that you have been a founder to be a great investor. However, I do think the more investors we have who have been founders, the better it is for the early stage ecosystem. In terms of people understanding, in terms of people being helpful, in terms of people really moving the needle, I think that would be a great thing for the Nordics and for Europe.
It's an interesting one because I remember I did some predictions, and I will ask you about your predictions in a second. I did this. It's been quite some years since I did so, and I remember one of them was I thought that we would see more ex-operators as venture investors, and that you've seen more in absolute numbers, but not in percentages. So it's guess I can say it's somewhat true, but not in terms of sort of the relative numbers as you talk about.
Yeah.
And it surprises me a bit. And I told you before we went on, one of the reasons why I left venture capital was because one of the companies that we had invested in that could basically pick the investors they wanted. I remember them coming back from the investor meetings, and they were always super excited when they had met someone who had been on the journey themselves, because they could just talk about the exact problems they were going through and they could relate immediately. And that's not to say the financial investors were not good. It was to have both and have someone who really understands, oh, you're at this phase, you must surely be struggling with this. They found that immensely valuable and decided to go with one of those investors. And here I was thinking, okay, I have never done it myself. I need to go out and get my hands dirty.
Yeah. And I think the analogy that I often use is that it's a little bit like speaking another language. You can learn a language, a foreign language, at an exceptional level. That's possible. But without living in that country, you will never fully appreciate all of the nuances of that language. So you can speak everything and you can learn everything, but it's the nuances that you will not get unless you have lived there. And for me, that's the analogy that I think works very well when it comes to founder and investor. Investor can speak the language without having done it, but they can't appreciate every little nuance. And actually, the most interesting thing, as you kind of alluded to there, is founders know. They know if you have been a founder yourself or not. They can instantly tell. Like, you don't even need to say it. Like, they actually know you've been a founder before. And that is very interesting to me.
I remember one of the things that I changed my opinion about a lot, or where I give different advice now, was about letting people go. I had this very sort of cocky attitude of, if it's not working out, you let them go. It's not that difficult. Just if you're in doubt, just get them out. And then I know this is different in the three Scandinavian countries, but it's both mentally draining. It's people you're talking about, and it's also very complicated in both in Norway and Sweden. I think Denmark is a little bit easier, but it's much more complicated than at least I made it out to when just giving the advice.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some of these things that on paper it's very easy to see, and then it's requires a lot more to do it in practice.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Yeah, now just circling back to the predictions. You have made some predictions about the Nordic tech in 2025. You don't have to list all of them here, but could you just try to highlight some of the most exciting trends or key trends that you have predicted for 25 here in the Nordics?
Yeah, I think this is definitely not an exciting one, but it's a necessary one for us to kind of talk about and acknowledge, is that this year is the year that we actually see all of the fallout from the last few years, from the kind of post-up era. That will happen this year. We will see a lot of companies shutting down. We will see a lot of exits, as we've already called them. And we will see a lot of VC funds as well be hit by that, right? Like local VC funds will have multiple write-offs, multiple companies shutting down, multiple companies exiting for cents on the dollar. And it's going to be a hard time for the ecosystem. And I think, sure, we have seen somewhat of an impact over the last couple of years. We can say that some of the tourists have left, but I don't think the people remaining have necessarily seen the full impact of these last couple of years playing out. I think there's a flip side of that is, and if I look at my own portfolio, is you seem to be going to extremes where I have companies that are not working out and will have to shut down or sell for cents on the dollar. But on the plus side, the ones that have worked through this period, they're raising great rounds, they're growing, they've got revenue, everything's going in the right direction. And so your portfolio kind of comes in these extremes, which, in venture capital, that is essentially the name of the game and what you expect. And that's definitely something we're going to see play out this year. And there will be further kind of consequences of that, right? It's like, will these funds that are hit be able to raise their next fund? Will these founders that failed want to go again, or will they want something more comfortable? We don't know that yet. And maybe it's a split. Maybe everyone starts something new. Maybe some great companies are going to be built this year or started this year. I think it's a little too early to tell. I think as an early stage investor, I am generally quite excited about the moment that we're in. I believe that while this macro exists, I just think that the greatest founders don't care too much about the macro. I just think that if they're obsessed about this thing that they need to build, they're not going to be like, oh, is it a great time to be raising money right now? Oh, is it like what's happening out there? No, they're just going to go and build it. And so, yes, sure, this macro is going to play out over our heads. But at the end of the day, great companies are still going to be built from this region, and I want to invest in them, right? And no kind of like outcome or no macros is going to stop me, and it's not going to stop those founders.
And what industries do you think would be the hottest, difficult one to predict? But here in Scandinavia, where do you think?
Like I think it's like almost silly to say AI, right? Because I think that will be part of like nearly every company. So that's a little bit kind of like, broad, but I still think that companies that are heavily focused in that space will raise, right? Everyone's looking at that. I think deep tech is kind of very interesting right now in the region as well. And then I think like anything in between will struggle a little to raise, because I think investor attention is going to either be like full in kind of like AI agents, wrappers, like anything, right? And then the other extreme is like very deep. So you got wrappers and then you got very deep tech. And then I actually think that everything in between will probably struggle a little.
Are there any other the trends you listed that you remember and you think are worth sharing?
I think that generally, it's funny you said that you kind of started in 2017. I was also starting out around that time. And for me, this period reminds me very much of 2017 in terms of like valuations, round sizes, how you can help companies. It's actually a very similar time. So it feels to me that we've kind of come out like this, but with more mature founders, with more mature ecosystem, right? So like the conditions have improved, but the round sizes, the valuations are back at a level where we were kind of beginning our journeys. And for me, having been in that environment before, it makes me feel more confident in terms of like how to help companies navigate those conditions. So I don't think I actually put that in my predictions, but it's something I've been thinking about recently, that like it's a little bit of a mirror of kind of like where we were at back in 17. So I don't think, and that was a great time. I mean, valuations were lower, but there were still some great companies being built then. And overall things were pretty optimistic. And I think that like that is similar to where we're at now. I don't feel like we're in this like major downturn. And so like, I'm not painting this picture of kind of doom and gloom saying that some companies will fail this year. I just think there will be some corrections, but I also think it's going to be kind of like positive as well.
If I now gave you a magic wand and and you could change something about the Scandinavian ecosystem, it can be the startup ecosystem in general. What would you change?
So I will maybe say a non-obvious one. I think that it should be more acceptable or more common practice that talent jumps around companies in the ecosystem. I think that when there's a rocket ship, I think it's okay for people to be jumping on that. I think it's okay to work at a company for a couple of years and then go and join another company for a couple of years and then do 1 year at another one and then do 1 year at another one. I think that having this experience across multiple startups is valuable. I think that people should gravitate towards the best companies. People should gravitate towards new opportunities, new challenges. And I think that at least my experience of building a company in a region was that there's a lot of comfort, a lot of complacency. And like, if you're at a decent company, you're quite unlikely to move, even if there is like a potential rocket ship that wants to hire you. So I think I would like to see kind of like more risk taken by talent. I would like to see more changes taken by talent and more rounded kind of, experiences from that, because ultimately, like, that's what the ecosystem relies on as well, right? It's not just the investors, not just the entrepreneurs, but it's the people that make up these companies. So maybe it should be a little more, say, acceptable or more commonplace for people to jump around.
I think it's very interesting because I can also imagine someone who joins a company thinking it's going to be a rocket ship, and then the next company comes and promises to be a rocket ship and shows all the metrics, but you might wonder if that will be true, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like that definitely is like the downside of it, right? But I guess that's just the nature of risk, right? And that's the nature of startups. And if you want to be part of these companies, and if you want to be working in these companies, it is part of what you take on, right? And it is part of the risk that you are taking by just even being in one of these companies in the first place.
I have one last question, which is advice to me. I've invested as a venture capitalist, but now trying to go more the angel route as I have my operator job and my day job. Do you have any advice? You've been in this space for quite some time, investing early phase and as an angel and now a solo GP. How do I become the best angel I can be, the most effective angel?
I think by focusing on your strengths and staying away from everything else. But I think putting your ego aside and being comfortable with what you do and don't know is actually super valuable, because I think it can be damaging to a company sometimes to give them bad advice. And so to give advice just because you feel like you should, because you're an angel investor, I think is actually bad practice. And you should be comfortable with saying, I don't know the answer to this, or I am not the right person to ask for this. And in a best case, you know someone that they should speak to instead. But don't be afraid to just say, I don't know, or like, I'm not the right person. And this is how I think about it. And I'm like, hey, I can really like help you, I think, in these 3 areas. Everything else, I'm not good at, right? I'm not the right person. So like, you shouldn't rely on me for that. But I can tell you what, if you have problems with this, or this, then I will be able to help you. And that's how I try and work with the companies I back.
I like that. And I am just now finalizing an investment in a company where you have also invested. So hopefully it's been a good choice.
Yeah, but that will be great to work together.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And thank you so much for joining. This is super interesting. As I said, you've been on the Nordic venture scene for what's it been now? 8 years?
I used to have
8-9 years.
Well, I had hair when we first met a long time. If you base the fact that the Nordics have contributed to 16% of unicorns in Europe and 16% of billion-dollar exits, we should actually have 3,000 new founders before 2030 in the Nordics that have some experience of having worked at a unicorn, which is like mind-blowing.